The sponsors and the supporters that we have are very much in favor of everyone being able to find the shortest and most efficient path to their dream car. And Vincero Watches was an upcoming sponsor for us at VINwiki Car Stories, and they wanted to kind of add to what we were doing. And so when I mentioned that my car was about to be done, Vincero said, hey, why don't we go a little bit above and beyond in the sponsorship for the next month, and then we'll help you with the expenses to go out there and really pick it up. Because I was kind of on the fence about whether or not I wanted to ship it back or go on a road trip. This idea of seeing what was happening with some friends buying dream cars and being able to put this whole trip together was something that I was excited for Vincero to help out with. They make these great watches that are inexpensive, and if you don't want to spend $10,000 on a really cool watch, you can buy one of theirs and fit in with anybody else, and it looks good with whatever you want to wear, and certainly in whatever you want to drive. The idea of a dream car means something different to everyone. There's not some universal one-size-fits-all idea, and amongst my friends, it's something that we talk about a lot is, what is your dream car, and what is it about that car that makes you love it? And so for me, it's a combination of obviously what the car is and what it stands for, how I can use it, and honestly, a lot about how it comes to be, how I get to own it, the shrewdness that's involved, you might say. And for me, the first time I saw a Lamborghini Murcielago being reviewed by Road and Track, I fell in love with it. And eventually, while they were still selling them, I went to work at Lamborghini Atlanta. And the image of the car on Top Gear being reviewed by Jeremy Clarkson in Verde Draco, to me was just as cool as anything could be. And he made the comment that he said, look, the option costs are insane. Like paying that much for stitching, that much for brakes, that much for carbon fiber is nuts. But the actual car is a real bargain for the performance that it is. And it was like 0.6 of a second slower around the Top Gear test track than an Enzo that was more than twice as much at MSRP and 4 times as much at a market price. And so I said, this is the dream car.
I started working at Motor Cars of Georgia right after they acquired the Aston Martin Point, and I think that was around the same time that they had announced their flagship, which was the Vanquish, which I just fell in love with immediately. Worked every angle that I could to take those as demos and take them to car shows and take people out to dinner and things of that nature. And I think it was pretty close to that time that I also ran my brand new motorcycle into the back of a Panamera. Fell in love with the car, always wanted one. They were 330 grand. I didn't have that kind of money. I always wanted to be able to buy those kind of cars. But instead, what I did was buy a lot of like Corvettes and, American muscle cars and things that just depreciated like crazy right after I bought them. After I built up a good 20 grand of negative equity, I started to think that maybe that wasn't the best way to buy the cars that I wanted. I was not trading up. And I was watching Ed buy these cars that seemed like maybe risky investments because they were older or had a lot of miles or had been totaled or sunk in a lake or something of that nature, financing them in ways that they were affordable. They were at least manageable, the payments were. You didn't have to have $330,000 sitting around to be able to do so. And I got very interested in that. Me being a slow mover, took me, I think, about a decade to sort out how I was going to do it personally. And that kind of came about because actually Ed was texting me about cars he was, interested in maybe procuring for himself for a particular rally. One of the ones that he sent over was this very high mile Vanquish out in California. I was sort of like, well, if you don't buy that one, let me know. Ed was very quickly like, well, I think you should buy it. And so, I sort of committed myself quickly, got scared, but couldn't back out because I had committed to doing it, to Ed and a few other people. And everybody was like, when you get in the Vanquish, when you get in the Vanquish, when you get in the Vanquish.
When I was about 19 years old, I started getting into buying cars and motorcycles. The first one I got was a Honda CBR 600, which was awesomely fast, inexpensive, and great around town, but dangerous. I would have close calls on that motorcycle every week. But there was one week where I had 6 close calls in 7 days. And at the 7th day, I said, that was too much. I parked the motorcycle. And I actually, in my mind, decided, I'm not going to ride this thing again. Luckily, my mom at that same time said, hey, I don't want you to ride the motorcycle. She knew nothing about my close calls. If you want to buy a car, I will help you get a loan because I was like 18 or 19 and had no credit. if you pay me back with really small interest rate, like same as a bank would pay out, and you never ride the bike again. She didn't know that I was planning to never ride the bike again. I did some shopping. I wanted an Integra GSR, but ended up finding an even better deal on a Honda S2000, a car that I thought was way out of my league. That ended up being the closest car to a motorcycle, effectively. It, revved to the moon, revved to 9,000 RPMs, had an open top. You feel like you're out there. It was very motorcycle-like. I absolutely loved it. Took it to the track, to Road Atlanta, my first track experience of my life. Had an amazing time with that, learned a lot, and did that for an entire year. At the end of the year, after multiple clutch repairs due to my driving style, I thought, maybe I can sell this car and see where I end up. I actually accidentally made a profit of a few grand, which was pretty substantial when you're in school at that age, and said, hey, why don't I do it again? So I started getting into Subarus, had a WRX, later an STI, started getting into BMWs, and basically slowly worked my way up the food chain of horsepower and took each of those cars to the track, learned a little bit about driving with each of them, and did that for a few years. Back then, the internet was not as popular for buying and selling cars. So because I was somewhat computer savvy, I had a bit of an advantage in terms of information over people. So I could get pretty decent deals. Ed was doing the same thing around the same time. We became friends around the time I was finishing up school. He was still in school. And, we were competing for slightly different cars. So that means we didn't have to be frenemies. We could just be friends and kind of share information about our deals. So I just kind of kept moving up the BMW world for a while and having fun tracking, a bunch of M cars.
Nobody had really done any research into exactly how rare the stick cars were. And Nicolas Cage's 2007 balloon white manual LP640, a car that I had taken on trade and sold into Canada in 2011 for 170 grand, out of the blue sold for $330,000. And nobody really knew if it was because it was Nicolas Cage's or because it went to Canada and the dollar was strong, whatever it was, just why the car sold for that much. But it did sell for a lot. And about 2 months later, I got a phone call from a guy who knew that I had kind of sold several of these cars over the years, and he said, hey, can you find me one? And I said, well, I know a few. Well, let me see what I can find out. And he said he really wanted a bright color. And I ended up selling an orange 07 LP640 stick car to him for a record number other than the Nicolas Cage car. It was a really good number. He was happy, loved it. He actually ended up totaling the car about 6 months later. But in the process of looking for those cars, I found a couple more, and I found a green one that was probably a little bit nicer, but it didn't become available until a couple weeks after he had bought, paid for, and taken delivery of the orange car. And so I decided, well, I'll just buy that car. And because of my relationships with banks like Premier Financial Services, I was able to get a loan for the whole thing. So no money down, take advantage of the credit that I built up and buy my dream car with no money down, just a monstrous monthly payment. And so I was so excited to have it, but it was so perfect. I mean, the car was as nice as one could be. It was the last 2008 built. And so this car that I'd bought for $215,000, I was able to sell about 14 months later for $350 grand. But the reason I was willing to do that is because I now knew where all of them were, and I'd gotten contacted by a guy who had one for sale that had kind of a sordid past. And it was a 2007, because they only made them 07, 08, and 09, but it was a Canadian car originally. And so I was able to get that car for 120 grand after making 135 on the green Verde Ethica 2008 LP640. And this car needed a little bit of cleanup work and some, maintenance catching up, but ultimately it was my dream car with a bad history that I could guiltlessly drive as much as I wanted. And so I bought that car, fixed it up, drove it like crazy, had an absolute blast in it. So I really liked it, but that image of a Verde Draco car was always out there in my mind. And I didn't really want to do anything to color change that car because gray over red is a terrific color combination. It was Grigio Telesto with a red and black interior. And I liked the car and was certainly happy to have it. But people kept kind of contacting me asking if they could buy it, because anytime you're dealing with a market where manual cars are preferred, they're preferred by people that want to drive. And so I had this guy who wanted to pay me 100 grand more than I'd paid for the car. And eventually I just kind of had to say yes. Like, that's more of a payday than I could ever turn away at this stage of my life. And so I sold, and I thought, hey, all right, I've had these cars, I loved them, but maybe I'll find something else. But as I really thought about it, I just couldn't get excited about owning anything else. It was still my dream car. And another guy who I knew from having kind of curated the database of the cars contacted me and said, hey Ed, I'd like to sell my higher mileage US '07 Stick LP640, but it was black. And I hate cleaning cars, and so black cars are kind of a no-no for me. But I said, hey, I knew this car had been kind of unaffectionately modified in the past. Big, crazy wheels. The bumpers had been resprayed badly. The rockers needed some touch-up. It had a wing drilled into the back at one point. And so the car needed about 2/3 of itself repainted to be nice. I found a company that could paint it, and I got the car. And so they started on it immediately. I literally took delivery of it at their facility, flew my mechanic out there to kind of inspect it, go through it, and they started. They said it was going to take 6 or 8 weeks to paint it. Well, a lot of things happened between then and now, and it took about 10 months. And so I decided that it was time for us to go out and pick it up. And I really wanted to make more of an event of taking delivery of my dream car. After all these cars, all these years, all these months of actually reconditioning this one. So I called 2 friends, Tom Park and Nick Underwood. And I told them, hey, I'm going out to Scottsdale, Arizona, to Tempe to pick up this car, and I'm going to drive it home. And I'd love for you guys who are at this unique moment of buying and using your own dream cars to come along. We can all kind of compare notes of what the journey there was like. And so Tom had just taken delivery of his paint to sample manual GT3 Touring, and Nick had just gotten his first gigantic car loan for an Aston Martin Vanquish. And so all of our browsing of sites like Auto Tempest, all of our dreaming, all of our car buying, all of our flipping, all of our financing, everything we'd ever had to do to buy a car had kind of come to fruition, and each of us were at that moment of buying this car that we had dreamt of.
It is probably worth noting that not only was I nervous about buying the highest mile one, and I was nervous about financing a car for longer than I had ever financed one for, and spending more money on a car than I had ever spent on a car, actually probably more money on that car than I'd spent on any 2 combined. I was also going to compound the issue by adding several thousand more miles to the highest mile Vanquish. And to me, that was a little bit concerning at first, but Ed made a good point, and the logic behind it was it's already the highest mile one. It's just going to continue to be the highest mile one. So you may as well have fun with it. And that's exactly how it worked out. Honestly, the difference in miles between the 46 that it had when I bought it and the 49 it had when I got it back to Birmingham was there's no difference in value there. And I think that is the real key to buying these cars, right? And that's what I've learned through this process is, first of all, you can finance them in crazy ways. You can get really, really creative. As creative as you can imagine the financing, you can actually procure the financing. And buying them when they're in those unique situations that they've had a serious depreciating event, like being the highest mile one, or maybe being crashed, or being just super old or something of that nature, you're buying them at the very bottom of what the market is, because that event was catalytic enough that it caused the bottom of the market to be found, and you're not going to go below the bottom of the market. They're just going to reach a certain point, and that's what they are. Buying the least expensive one and the highest mile one, and then from the California dealer for 90-something thousand, actually brought the market up more likely than it brought it down. It taught me that you don't need to be scared of those. Actually, you probably need to run to those when you're looking for an exotic car like that.
Fast forward a couple of years, I stopped trading cars, buying and selling used cars, and started getting into doing European delivery, picking up BMWs, and figured out a system where I could pretty much get a small discount on BMWs, go drive them around Germany, go to the Nürburgring, which was my primary objective, do Autobahn and mountain driving too, which was about the most fun thing I'd ever discovered you can do with a car, that combination of that type of trip. After I did that a couple times, I started to build a relationship with my Porsche dealer, and BMWs kind of started dropping off as pure driver cars, and Porsche GT cars really started coming up and becoming the driver's cars since 2014. I got back into a GT3, absolutely loved it. It revved to 9,000 and was one of the first cars to do so since the S2000. So I loved that, but it was a paddle shift car. Later, they came out with a GT4, which my dealer, Porsche Atlanta Perimeter, was able to get me, and I did my first European delivery on a Porsche. Had the best driving experience I've ever had in my life in Europe with the GT4. Took it to, I think in 12 days of having the car in Europe, I took it to 7 track days and had an absolute blast the whole time. I loved it in some ways better than the GT3 because of the manual was just perfectly executed in that car. Later, they called me, the Porsche Atlanta called me and said, do you want a GT3 RS? And my end game was really to get a cool paint to sample car, but I wanted that 9,000 RPM and I wanted a manual. There were rumors that they were going to bring the GT3 back with the manual, which had previously been killed in favor of the paddle shifters. So I said, okay, well, I'll get the RS, but my end game is really to get a paint to sample rumored manual GT3. So bought that car from them, later traded it back, and was able to secure a GT3 paint to sample allocation. Fast forward a little bit, about a year after working that out, I got to go do the pickup, got to go pick up the GT3 and drive it around. It was everything I hoped for. It combined the spirit of the S2000, 9,000 RPM, plus a manual, the performance and torque of basically of the GT3 RS, the 4-liter, and the manual of the GT4. And it was everything I wanted in a dream car from all the previous cars I had owned in one neat package.
I knew that I paid $90,000 for a $330,000 car. Nobody else in the world knew that. This was a 2014. Nobody else in the world knew that. All people did when they saw this car was just talk about how beautiful it was, how gorgeous it sounded, how amazing it must be. Everybody thought this was a $330,000 car, which truly drove and felt and looked like a $330,000 car for $850 a month. And I had spent $850 a month on my last Ram truck. So it was a significant improvement in my book.
While in Europe, I extended the insurance coverage on the GT3 so I could have it there a little bit longer, plan a couple track days that I really wanted to do, like Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium and Nürburgring, my 2 favorite tracks in the world. Got to budget all those in, did about, I think, 5,000 miles in 3 weeks there. Probably had not only the best road trip of my life, but the best vacation of my life, and basically got to drive the fastest car I've ever driven in Europe, which was spectacular on Autobahn and on mountain roads and on track. They wanted to ship it back to my home dealer, which is in Atlanta, but I asked if they could ship it to the furthest away place from my dealer so I could have more fun driving it back. They shipped it to Seattle for me, and I did a drive from Canada all the way down to Mexico along the Pacific Coast Highway. Had another dream trip there before connecting with Ed and joining him on his dream car trip.
So the road trip back was a lot of fun. It was fairly undramatic. We only got pulled over once, and it was a fairly easy to dispense with warning that honestly it was just a cop that wanted to see what that Lamborghini was doing on his road in the middle of the night. And admittedly, you are supposed to have 2 functional headlights in the great state of New Mexico. So be it. But Tom had some fun driving out with us and then circled back out west, and Nick made it home in his dream car. And it's just one of those things that the adventure of acquisition, the pleasure of driving as far as you ever want to, and just understanding what the car stands for with respect to what we do here at VINwiki and documenting the history of cars and in curating the rarity of cars and everything else that I've done through my career with cars really culminates in what this car is. And at this point, until it, appreciates to be an even swap with the Veyron, I can't really imagine parting with it. I love the way it looks. I love the way it drives. I love the way it sounds. I love the way it feels. I love everything that's crazy about a car. A Murcielago is even crazier. And to me, crazy cars are supposed to be crazy. We've gotten them all so good and so technologically adept with these double clutch gearboxes and electronic suspensions and variable steering rates and things that they make them faster. They might even make them more reliable or cheaper to run in some cases, but this is just so analog, so visceral, and so extreme that it's everything that I ever want a car to be. And so it's my dream car, maybe nobody else's dream car, but I was so pleased to have had the privilege of going along on the journey of what it really took. Several cars, several steps, several reconditioning efforts, but ending up with exactly the car that I want to have in my garage. True negotiation starts with finding the right car, and the best way to do that is with Autotempest.com. Autotempest allows you to compare the results from Craigslist nationally with all the top listing sites. So visit Autotempest.com today and see where your next dream car is hiding.